Hello again, and thank you once again for letting me share with you my Arc of Folktales Raven today from 2017. So far we've seen Raven resolve the sort of tragedy of the leper colony and puzzle through that, as well as looking at the odd and uncanny metaphor of the archaeological site and what it meant for spiritual resurrection. And he also, along with Spirit Bear, solved the puzzle of the metaphoric content of names and namesakes. And yet the overall mystery seems to be just as far away from being solved as it was before. So we'll follow Raven and his friends yet further and yet deeper into the mystery with Chapter 4, Raven and the Shadows. The charnel houses of the Great Death had saddened Raven almost beyond his ability to think. It was an existential paralysis. Nothing in the history of his people had compared to it. It had been something that could only be described as both the living end and the end of the living. But there had been a balance. The fact that his children had survived and begun to come back, both culturally and existentially, was as great a triumph of the human spirit as was the shadow that had cast itself over that self-same spirit. Raven was never more proud of his people than he had been recently, but he himself had been placed into an unusual position. The more outward success his people had, the less they relied on his inner presence. In his contemporary travels, Raven had also found out something else that was worthy of note. Before the newcomers had come to his land, long before, they too had suffered a great death that had almost destroyed their culture. Another kind of illness, but a similar one, contagious in the extreme, with seemingly no defense against it. Ironic, Raven thought, and he wondered if all people once in their history had to face down their own demise, kind of like a single being who had come face to face with his or her own mortality. And how many lives did a culture possess? His friends and comrades covered the spectrum of what Raven had understood as imminence. For Squirrel, for instance, her fate could be close at hand, and she might not be aware of it. For his friend Eagle, anything dangerous to him he would note at a great distance. Nothing could really sneak up on Eagle. So all the beings that Raven knew embodied in their own respective individuality the forms of both life and death that came to, or could come to, all those who were his children and all others besides. Since the Great Death, Raven had always been concerned that it might happen again. The next time, he vowed, he would prevent it or stop it before it got too bad. Standing now in front of the ancient remains of a mortuary house, its guardian poles shrunk down to mere mossy stumps, its beams embedded in the ground, a ground that would also have contained the ground-up bones of hundreds of his people, he stumbled across something laying out before the frame of its former self. A rattle! Raven turned it over in his talons and found that it bore his very own likeness. This must have belonged to a shaman, Raven reckoned. He picked it up in his beak and shook it. At first there was no sound, but as he tried again there came to his ears a faint rattling, as if something was being heard from a great distance. Raven cocked his head. He shook the artifact once again, and this time a fuller sound could be heard. Raven wasn't exactly keen on summoning the spirit of the dead shaman. Generally speaking, one would think that it would have long since moved on to inhabit some new person, and so on down the generations, for there was originally a very limited pool of human souls with which to animate the newly born. But standing where he stood in a landscape that had been haunted for just over 150 cycles, the rattling might well foretell of a different kind of presence. Raven now found himself shaking, and then, good Lord, the earth began to shake. It was just a tremor at first, but grew and grew into a true quake. Raven dropped the rattle and was immediately aloft. Upon attaining a fair height, he looked down and beheld that the rattle continued to shake by itself, which gave Raven a bit of a shiver. But he was curious nonetheless, having not seen this particular event transpire ever before. A shaman's magic was as inscrutable as the practitioner, and Raven had met many of the finest over the years. Of course, their tricks were a mere mimicry of his own, but nevertheless some of them were quite clever, and the people certainly had been impressed with them. Yes, impressed to the point of fear, Raven added to himself. You didn't cross a shaman unless you had magic as good as he. Since few could claim such a skill, the shaman was aloof to most entreaties. But Raven had evidently started something up down there, and he once again floated back to get a better look. Something was coming out of the ground. Raven did not set down, not quite yet. His beady eyes glistened with intrigue. He squinted into the earth to see who, or what, was emanating from it before it fully appeared. But this time his powers were met with a shadowy mist, the occult version of the kind of thing Thunderbird would often create along the rugged and forested coastline. This is not a spirit I am seeing, but some spirit's own shadow, Raven thought. This is interesting. The spirit has moved on, but its shadow, attached to the body in life and then detached, disembodied in death, would usually cling to the spirit in return as well. But something had gone wrong. Could Raven speak to a mere shadow, a thing that was nothing? I apologize, placid penumbra of being, for disturbing you after all these generations. Perhaps I may be of service to you after all this time. And why did you abandon us during our time of need? Was the altogether disturbing reply, spoken in an old dialect of the fierce people of the northern archipelago. Raven was hurt by this accusation. He hadn't abandoned his children, and never would. He hovered there. The shadow had now fully emerged from the earth, but the ground had not stopped shaking, and the rattle, rotten and ancient as it was in danger of tearing itself to bits. I understand your bitterness. The shadow of conquest and death has not entirely left to this day. I observe it and try to help where I can. But for many, I am old hat as well, no better than you, and no more competent. Then you know me after all. You share my fate. Your own children have turned against you because you once let us down. This was becoming too much for Raven. Not only was it hyperbolic at best, at worst it was slanderous and irresponsible. He had always done what he could. No one could save the dead of that time. They simply had to return over time, and indeed, they had been doing so. Even Cayuman herself had said that she had lost track of the number of souls who had appeared before her all at once, and now no one knew how many remained in waiting to reappear in a newborn, the children of the future. This shadow was very much behind the times, Raven thought, but how to respond to it? I am no shadow, my lost companion. I have seen the resurrection of my people and their culture, and I see it still. If you have been left behind, perhaps you would now like to join us once again. There, now, that was diplomatic. This wasn't Ciseutal, who could look after himself, or, say, Deer, who could appear in thousands of places at once, like Bear, but even more so. No, this being was uncared for and cared nothing for others as well. Raven took a chance and set himself down at some small distance from the dark and ambiguously shaped form. You don't trust me, then, was what it said in response to this overture. You are no Boquist of the spirit realm, I suppose, said Raven. At this the shadow snorted. There is wild, and there is evil, trickster bird. I wonder, though, you have seen evil things, and that perhaps you have not known the source of evil, or, in the world of men, the evil of evil. Raven was taken aback at this language, guttural and not earthy, deep and yet lacking the depth of feeling that the one who had crafted the rattle must once have had. But shamans didn't always make their own equipment. This must be one of those powerful shamans from another time, Raven thought to himself. Someone the people would have found to be extremely dangerous. Someone who could command the magical forces around him and set them to his bidding. A sorcerer, then. Not just a shaman. But what did he mean by the evil of evil? Did you perchance discover the secret of the plague and die before you had the opportunity to cure your village? Raven thought this a clever maneuver, but it was greeted by nothing other than a derisive laugh. Ha! You would escape my remonstrance by trying to make me into something I never was? Clever one. At times I wished I had invented the plague myself and set it on my own people. So much they disdained my powers and shunned my person. Oh, this was truly disturbing. Raven knew, of course, that the source of the plague had been the newcomers. Even they were sometimes sickened by it, especially by their children, and many white people died too. Far more of his people, though, because it was a newcomer's disease after all. But was it possible this shadow, the resentful memory of all that had been in the shaman's own consciousness, and had somehow gotten the idea that when a newcomer's child did in fact die, that he himself had been the device by which such a death had occurred? This was something altogether novel in Raven's experience, and yet it was manifestly something out of the past, and not the new world of the present. Is this why you have remained here, then, with the remains of all of the others? You could at least gloat over their untimely demise, and in a time out of all time, you could do so for evermore. I think this to be close to the truth, and yet I do not shun you, even so. There, bite on that one, Raven thought, himself a little resentful now at this being's own disgust. The ground shook ever more forcefully. The shadow being had raised itself fully out of the ground and into the air. Could it also fly like he himself? Raven gritted his beak and stayed where he was. No spirit of any kind was going to cow him, for after all, was he not the spirit of the entire coast? And yet for the first time since the Great Death and its immediate aftermath, Raven felt a rare feeling that made him shake in minor counterpoint to the earth itself, a feeling of fearfulness. The shadow then spoke once again, its voice dripping with venom and sarcasm alike. If Sisutel had ever had a mentor, could one of the dark shamans of yesteryear influence the course of events from beyond the grave? Could this be one small reason why his people had taken so long to recover their wits and their purpose? I think you are here because you know you're as irrelevant as I am myself, was what the being blasted out of its cross-haired apertures. The shadow had many mouths, yes, but none spoke the truth of things. This was a manner of evil, Raven well knew. The more voices, the more likely one would choose one to believe in. But what if all voices spoke in falsehoods? This was what had occurred at the mission schools. There were many missions, and many were the shamans of the newcomers, but their magic had been a conjury of high words and low deeds. You are simply looking for someone to blame, shadowy one, and since I am who I am, I can take the blame for what occurred. The people needed me, and I could not save them, but I endured, and so did they. You should have arisen long ago and joined with the movement of life. This is no one's fault but your own, but even now I reach out to you. Raven was still taking the high road. His people had long ago forgave him and his friends for their collective plight, and the continuing abscess of the conquest had made it easy, perhaps too easy, to do so. Do you have me believe that this is the first time in all these generations that you have returned to this place? Well, it might wonder, Raven concurred, and yet it was the truth. Believe what you like. I have never set foot in this village since the Great Migration, since the last villagers left this haunted place. Then you have made your last mistake, was what the shadow responded with. Before Raven could react to this foreboding utterance, the shadow had enveloped him and was trying to squeeze the life out of him. The rational part of Raven's superior mind was nodding its mental head and saying, "This is exactly what I expected. Killing me is like what happened to the newcomer's god. Then everyone thinks belief is irrelevant, that you can live without faith. Now that too is an evil shadow over humankind, and this shadow being thinks it is that great shadow, death itself, but it is not." And all the while Raven's rationality was thinking this, his emotions were screaming at him to fight and get away. But Raven was in fact finding himself being dragged back down and right into the ground. The shadow being had nothing that Raven could poke out and injure in any way. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, and most importantly, no brain. All of that had vanished into the dusts of time, and the spirit to which this shadow had been attached must be elsewhere by now, surely. Then again, what kind of person would live life without his or her own shadow? You would wonder if you were really there, Raven thought to himself as he began to lose sight of the air above his head. It is my own bad conscience upon which the shadow plays its unholy dirge, Raven realized. Well then. And where were you, O so powerful shaman of the night sky? What did you offer in defense of this village, and all the hundreds of others? How pathetic your magic must have been, and what a fraudulence your vessel had to be, in threatening your own people with the dark arts while they were still alive, and yet offering them nothing in their death throes. At this, the shadow began to lose its grip on Raven. Aha! Tit for tat. On the other hand, if this thing still had a conscience, albeit a bad one, then the person who was now animated by its spirit was living without more than just its shadow. Now that was also a disturbing thought. Who could it be? I was one of the first to die. My death itself brought the plague to this place, for afterwards the people of the village saw that it could strike down even the most powerful of their fellows. Had I more time, I might have reckoned a response to it. Don't flatter yourself, Shadow Shaman. The newcomers themselves had no cure and died from it as well, just not as many, for their men and women were used to such things, but their children not so much. Now the grip of the shadow had loosened considerably. It was clearly realizing that it too had been rather pointless when it counted. Too bad, thought Raven, now able to shake some of the earthy humus off his feathers. Almost there, he thought to himself. You will take me with you. This was better. You must show me your spirit. Where is it? Who is it? You say you know the true source of evil in the world? Then take me to it. No one can live without both a shadow and a conscience. You're not as smart as people think, Raven. Don't you realize that if a man sheds both, he can imagine himself as something better than human? A god on earth, as the newcomer's shaman had it. I scared him off, and he never returned to this place. But before I died, I'd heard there were others about. Too true, Raven recalled, but that was the past. They had a new problem to resolve now. Who amongst their people would be tempted to proclaim himself the new Messiah, the one who could save Raven's children and lead them? Well, where? The people love me, it is true, but love is not as blind as you would have one believe. What blinds people is being in love, and not love. And you, dear Shadow, are in love with yourself. That did it. Raven was free of the Shadow's death grip, and after shaking the remainder of the humus off of him, he got aloft and was able to look down at his would-be adversary. Now he knew for certain this thing was not as evil as it had claimed. For one, it had announced its evil intents. Truly evil beings never did so, in order to blindside their victims all the more thoroughly. 2. His own ethical argument had swayed it into weakness and self-loathing. True evil had no conscience. So, what to do next? I have no idea where the spirit to whom I was attached has ended up. Why should it even be alive? How many of your children, so-called, are there even left? I would have thought all had perished. That just shows how little faith you have in your own kind, Shadow Dancer. My children are set to flourish once again. Yes, it has been a great struggle, but I have been beside them, with them, for each cycle, and we have endured together. Now no newcomer can destroy us, unless, of course, all are destroyed. Wait a minute. Good Lord, that might well be it. Raven upbraided himself for not guessing at it sooner, but after all, the Shadow had distracted him with its ghoulish plaintive. Raven continued. You must grab onto my talon and wrap yourself around it and it alone. If you try anything else, I will dip my foot into the salt water and you will be drowned. Or perhaps because you seem a kindred spirit to the murky beings of the deep, they will come for you and entertain you in their undinal depths. I will come with you only if to see you fail, vain bird. Oh, really? But then the Shadow changed his tack somewhat. Well, I should say that if you do fail, then I myself will destroy my ancient comrade, the spirit who tricked me and left me behind, as if it could lead the good life and only the good. I admit I want that spirit to be run down. Okay, so we're agreed on that point at least, Raven thought with a sigh. But he knew he needed one other thing besides the weightless shadow of a self that now had wrapped itself around one of his talons as promised. Raven swooped low and deftly picked up the rattle. What worked with you will work with the other, he stated simply. The Shadow snorted, but did its best impression of a nod of affirmation. How clever was Raven after all these years? But the Shadow did know one thing. The shaman to whom it had been attached in life had tried to outsmart the transformer beings and paid the ultimate price for its attempt. For the secret to the plague was the fact that it too transformed, but no one could ever see it. It had no caves wherein one could clandestinely view the sacred and mysterious dance, or overhear the chant of chants. No, it was so tiny that even Raven's beady eyes could not catch it, and Eagle's vision was also stumped. No one could see it. Raven was now hearing the Shadow's musings, given that it had, in a sense, become his own shadow, attached to him as it was. It had given him an idea, one that the Shadow would not at all have been able to think of by itself. If the plague was also a transformer being, though a microscopic one, then Kanakalak, as some called him, grandiose and overbearing though he was, might well have had some knowledge of it. Indeed, the more Raven thought about what the Shadow had ranted on about, the more he was convinced that Kanakalak the transformer might well be the one who had put up the person who was trying to live without either a shadow, that is, no self-doubt or sense of perspective, and a conscience, that is, no sense of being of others and of the whole. So, in fact, the first part of this journey had to be in the direction of Kanakalak himself. But what on earth direction was that? Raven thought Kanakalak's idea of posterity was somewhat dubious. Had any of the intrepid figures he had transformed into rocks, big and small, wanted to be remembered in such a fashion? From the spear fisherman at the extreme southern tip of the Big Island, to the Siwash pillar in the Great Harbor to the northeast, to the deer hunter west of the second largest of the newcomers' cities on the Big Island, and many more besides. And if one thought oneself much further back in time, Kanakalak's heroics had become yet more grandiose. The Zuhalem, for instance, or the Shtawamus. But Raven had a trick in his feathers now as he flew northward, and Kanakalak was going to come in very handy indeed. The only way to locate the transformer being who didn't have an animal center was to sully one of his works. The pronoun his Raven used as a mere convenience because no one knew if Kanakalak even had a gender. Since the shadow being was wrapped so tightly around one of Raven's talons, he knew he was going to have to suffer some slight injury himself in performing this feat, but it would be worth it. Raven had since realized that he had encountered the most dangerous leg of his contemporary travels thus far, and in fact, the shadow being was only the first part of the challenge and one that was also the lesser. Flying lower now, Raven saw his goal, a giant cliff that had protruded at a crazy angle out of the forest floor. It had no real right to be just where it happened to be, and that was a sure sign Kanakalik had been at work. Whoever had been honored in this permanent manner, Raven hadn't a clue, but he curled the tips of his wings up and prepared to dive right into it. The shadow being, who for the length of the flight had been content to remain silent, suddenly noted Raven's steep descent and unfurled itself slightly to comment upon it. But before it had a chance to say anything, Raven had at the last moment swept upward and slammed the talon it was wrapped around into the cliff face. He winced with the pain of it, but it had worked. The talon was cracked right off his foot, and the shadow being was now stuck to the cliff face, the sharp talon having buried its point into the actual rock. There was a deep scratch on the surface of it. That should be enough to attract Kanakalik's attention. There was a low rumble. Raven knew that the transformer did that to strike fear into his quarry so that he or she would remain still, so Kanakalik could turn them to stone. But Raven couldn't be affected by any such thing, of course, so he waited there, unsure if the shadow being understood what he might be planning. With a bright flash and a loud thunderous clap, Kanakalik himself had now arrived. Everything the ancient transformer being did was overly and overtly dramatic, thought Raven. After all, the Guardian froze up people too, and she didn't make a sound in doing it. Raven tried not to yawn as Kanakalik began to berate him for what he had done. Raven, what cleverness draws upon my work, vandalizes it with your scratchy claw, and you have stained it besides, with some dark writhing pestilence. What is that? The soul of the illness that killed your children? Why put it on me, after all? How many of the newcomers' giant canoes did Thunderbird and Siseutel destroy on the sharp rocks of my other works? We did our part to stymie the conquest. That was certainly true, Raven mused, cocking his head in Kanakalik's direction. There had been much loss of life amongst the newcomers as well, so much so that even Raven was surprised that they had seen fit to see it through and move in anyways. But what was done, and Kanakalik never needed any grand excuse to remake the land in front of him. "O great transformer, I have here the source of the new, the raw material for the traditional carving of model poles and pipes and the like." "Surely you jest." "Aha, oh, now I understand. Wait just a moment." Kanakalik adjusted itself and let loose. A blast of force, part sonic and part like a kind of material wind that one could certainly both feel and see, and the shadow being had been changed into a sheet of soft shale, argillite. It now covered the earlier cliff face and was itself imposing upon the forested surroundings. Raven knew that the old source of the precious stone was almost depleted, so here was a way in which the cast-off shadow of the old shaman spirit could be put to good use. Raven was quite delighted at the outcome of the first part of this dangerous mystery, but since it too had been done and was done, he moved to bid Kanakalik an immediate farewell. Besides, he was still bleeding and stinging from the loss of the talon. When next he landed, he would have to do so on one foot for a while. "I thank you, great transformer, for you have not only replenished the supply for this fine art, but also recalled the model by which my children will now themselves transform your work into their own, honoring us both." Kanakalik looked like he had never thought of such a metaphor, obvious though it was. "Why, Raven, that is clever. I see you are still living up to your reputation. But what was that dark thing that now can animate the shady stone and be turned to both art and use?" "I am about to find out, old Kanakalik. In fact, I could still use your help at the end of it. How might I find you again at the crucial moment?" "I admit to being so taken with your first trick, Raven, that I will keep close at hand." There was a first time for everything, it seemed, Raven thought, as he flew up and off again. The manner in which Kanakalik moved around was not like Lightning Snake, for he was far too large and heavy to ride on a bolt of electric light. At the same time, exactly how he progressed was something of a mystery, given that Raven had to call to mind that he did not have an animal center and was one of the only Transformers who did not. Although it was in Raven's nature to pry into all things, he had long ago decided to let this one lie. After all, Kanakalik's appearances were quite rare, and the only ones ever affected by them were some few of his children. That part of it was still a little shady, but Raven at least could concur that having a few of the ancestors, and even some of the first people recognizably present through the ages, had helped his children maintain their traditions, and it would still be so. But unlike the irascible and resentful shadow being, the spirit that had cast it off and left it in the mortuary ground of the long-abandoned village was something and someone that Raven did not want to see remembered in any way. But Kanakalik could also freeze people into immobility for all time without making a note of it and celebrating their continued presence as outlandish landforms. It was this second ability that Raven was going to presume upon next. For Raven already had an idea regarding the identity of this spirit, and then also what kind of person it would now be animating. What didn't quite yet connect was how the spirit of the shaman had itself been co-opted back at the time of the Great Death. Raven knew that before the mystery was resolved, that part of it would also have to come to light somehow. But the means for locating this maleficent spirit was held in his other set of talons, the ancient rattle, which when shook, would quite literally rattle the spirit out of its no doubt highly polished veneer of demeanor. It had not been a chance thing that Raven had seen it and then shook it over the sacred and haunted ground. Now he would have to do the same thing again, but of course there would likely be many attempts before he got the correct place. This could not be helped, for though there were no more mission schools, there were still a great variety of missions going on, children still forcibly in attendance, though fortunately for only a small portion of their lives. Raven knew the children would survive this time around, since the mission held only a tiny part of their overall attention, but even so, it riled him that the newcomers still practiced this nonsense, even in the slight way they now did. It was also ironic, and even perverse, that they practiced upon themselves that which they had set out to destroy the remainder of his own people. It suggested that the newcomers, for all their cleverness, lacked insight into their own souls. But it wasn't Raven's job to provide it either. His mission was, however, to make sure that the spirit that had sabotaged his children's sacred circle could not rise up again and strike. Somewhere, likely in the sprawling mass of the newcomer's giant city to the south, of the equally giant pair of cats, the vindictive, scheming spirit of hate resided and practiced its sorcery. Yes, the shaman of the fierce people's village had also been a sorcerer, and the people had feared him. That was his wont, and the dark arts he had mastered were to be feared, but their range and scope paled in comparison with that which had been enacted at the mission schools. Everything the newcomers did had to be enlarged beyond the spirit of its original frame. Why this was so, Raven had not understood. People lived in regions and did not inhabit whole worlds. In order to do that, other peoples would have to move or die, which is exactly what had occurred in his land. Had this also happened the world over? Now Raven was distracted by another line of thought, and he had to abruptly put it away from him so he could continue to concentrate on the search. And just then he found himself staring up, far up into the line of mountains that ringed the northern exposure of the giant city, and yes, just there, the pair of great cats, far larger than the guardian herself, and covered with manes that she herself never sported. Some had said this was also the work of Kanakalik, but Raven didn't believe it. It didn't make any sense. No animal of this kind had ever lived in his land, so how could they have been transformed into rocky fixtures at the top of a tall mountain? No, this time it really was just coincidence that the rocks looked like a larger version of Cayuman with some added decoration. Raven knew that chance did operate in the world, just not as often as the newcomers thought it did. But it was operating right now, and in a way, against him. There were many churches of the ilk that Raven posited might hold the evil spirit of sacral sabotage. This person must be found, for only he could answer the question of how he had stolen the shaman's blackest arts and taken them for himself to be used against Raven's children, and indeed, now also against the newcomer's own children. Devious, drastic, desperate. No, just that last word was the one that nailed it. Desperate. This motion, these emotions were the last mark of a desperate aspect of the newcomer's soul that was almost lost. Indeed, Raven had suddenly figured out another part of the puzzle. These arts of resentment and fear were the newcomer's equivalent of the mourning his own people had come through after the great death and destruction. Yes, that was it. But why did the newcomers feel these feelings? What were they in mourning about? Surely it couldn't still be their own great death. No, that was too far back to be recalled in any palpable manner. Raven was impressed that the mysteries of the New World were all the more sophisticated and deep than those of the Old. But it was inevitably so. And yet he had solved each in turn thus far. His confidence was strong, even if the task in front of him was a little bit on the desperate side itself. Raven kept that feeling down for now, though, and tried to concentrate. He peered into each of the mission buildings in turn. There were perhaps 36 of them, but the spirit didn't have to be here. Raven had simply chosen the largest city as the most obvious starting place. And this time chance was against him. Nowhere in any of the missions did Raven find who he was looking for. The ancient rattle, now used so much that it was really holding itself together by virtue of Raven's own talons clawing it tightly, would not be of use much longer. And there were no contemporary shamans to build him another one that had its powers. Raven grimaced as he flew up the great river past yet another one of Kanakalik's famous accomplishments, the Stolo. Farther and farther, to a mid-sized town that rested at the confluence of two other rivers. Their meeting place was called Kamloops. Still nothing, but now a clue. The rattle had revealed, from far above, a man running to his land canoe and getting it underway. He went south, and Raven followed him. It was only a hunch, but when he had shaken the magic rattle, the first person he saw had been this man, who had even looked up in his direction and scurried off. Fortunately, Raven had been flying all this while with Sun at his back, so the man saw nothing. Even so, Raven reckoned that if this or any other person had the spirit of the corrupted shaman inside him, as well as part of another spirit, whose identity Raven had not yet established, but about whom he had the gravest suspicions, thanks to the story of the shadow being, that he would have had at least a sense of danger. That was why he took off in the rapid manner he did. But Raven was not to be deterred by any detour on the part of his potential quarry. The path was winding, but that slowed the pace of the land canoe just enough that Raven was able to keep up. As far as Kanakalik went, well, he could appear next to any of his monuments, and even Raven didn't know the exact location of all of them. There had been so many over the ages. It would have been far better to have Eagle give this kind of aerial chase. He was built for just such a purpose and never ever lost his prey. But Raven gritted his beak and flew as hard as he could. There was a great deal at stake here, not just the future of his own people, in fact, but the future of all people, or at least the shape of that future. And Raven, after witnessing the horror of the mission schools, did not wish that upon anyone, even in an altered and slighter form. No, there was real danger here, and the newcomer still didn't seem to understand it. Just so, it was right here and now that Raven could help them, though some of his friends might question such an act. Not Eagle, who Raven had just been wishing he was more like, for he had the gift of far-sighted vision. Eagle might even know what shape this dark sorcery would take in the future. But part of Raven didn't want to even know that. The thing was to put a stop to it in the here and now. The land canoe had now slowed. Aha! Another mission. This time in a large city in the heart of Sun's favorite landscape. Sun, far above him, was beaming down at everything in his path. At some point, Raven knew he would have to encounter Sun again and ask him a rather large favor. But that was also for the future just ahead, and Raven couldn't be distracted by what at this time was still only a strong intuition. The man had gotten out and ran into the building. That was not going to save him, Raven thought a little grimly. Now I am almost certain this is the fellow in question, he thought to himself, and looked around to see if any of the local landforms might be put down to Kanakalik's whimsical pedantry. There might just be one, just over there, he thought, espying a large square-cut boulder by the side of a hill. Now Raven set his beak again, for what he was about to do was both violent and vehement, altogether shocking, and yet somehow just. He raised himself up in mid-flight and used all of the torque of his body to fling the ancient rattle right into the roof of the building. There was a small explosion, and the fire of spiteful rage had begun. Raven wheeled up in the sky, doing his best impression of his closest friend, and then, when a hole in the roof of the mission had opened up to the flames below him, he dove right through it, his jet-black feathers unaffected by the heat. The man was cowering behind a small wooden tower at the front of the church. Raven lit right on top of it and glowered down at the man. You, sir, are the artful saboteur of the dark shaman, and the one who cast your own dross of shadow upon my children's sacred ground. I bid thee now to give up your unholy duet of song and dance, and reveal the other, to whom the co-opted shaman was attached. The man cowered back. How was this bird speaking to him at all? How did it know of his history when he himself had only the barest sense of what had occurred? Raven knew that the man himself could not answer for his spirit's past deeds, and part of the tragic irony involved in resolving this mystery had to include his death. The smoke and flame were all around now, and the man was asphyxiating in its mist. But this was the smaller issue. It was almost time for Kanakalik to make a curtain call. Raven scanned round and croaked out a special greeting that only the transformer beings would understand. After the third attempt, Raven saw that it still worked after all these ages. Kanakalik was now present, looking puzzled and a little miffed that he should have to breathe such an atmosphere in the very summer where there had been so many fires in the great forests where many of his own monuments resided. Raven, what have you done here? This building reached none of your children, or did it? That wasn't the point, and Raven wasn't about to waste time arguing with Kanakalik about his sense of duty and ethics. Freeze this joint spirit as it escapes its material vessel, and we shall see exactly who it is, and hear from it itself its vanity and its profanity alike. A nation of profanation is what it will attest to, I have no doubt. Raven's voice was commanding and strong in the midst of the conflagration, and even Kanakalik was impressed by his single-mindedness. It appeared that Raven, when spurred to action, had lost none of his confidence, nor, for that matter, his confidences, that his artful trickery. Kanakalik nodded. The thing was done, and frozen before them stood a repulsive amalgam of two traditions, the very worst of both worlds, Raven realized. So, you have found me at long last, stupid bird. How long did it take you? And how many died in the meanwhile? And you, great fraudulence of a semi-skilled sculptor, what hope you to attain by this discovery? The minister sorcerer was referring to Kanakalik now, and the being in question narrowed his strange eyes in return. I do not hope, but rather will that you shall never be remembered by anyone ever again. And I think my old friend here agrees, was Kanakalik's simple yet eloquent response. So now Raven knew that the shadow being had been correct. A shaman of the newcomers had visited the ancient village and battled with its own shaman. This latter had died of the plague soon thereafter, but because the fierce people had some dark arts of their own, once in spirit forms, the newcomer had been able to convince this part of the shaman's spirit to join it in vengeance, pretending that the plague had been sent by the newcomer's own god to punish the unbelievers of Raven's children. Utter nonsense. But the shaman, scapegoated and shunned in his own culture, had just enough resentment in his soul to have gone along with this idea. Well, enough is enough, Raven thought decisively. If the newcomers themselves were too stupid to realize that it was still happening, he would finish it for them. He gestured to Kanakalik. In one moment the fires had been put out, and the concrete foundation of the church had been painted over with a blackened surface, thin and dissolute, a worthy monument to an unworthy soul. Raven knew everyone would simply think that the color had been caused by the fire, and would never guess of its actual origin. I trust that will settle the score for this one, Kanakalik declared with unction. I am in your debt for this, venerable transformer. I trust that you will let me know if you encounter any more spirits like the one we have just vanquished. Ah, but Raven, all you have to do is look around you. How many of the newcomers' houses and missions have only their stones left to them? Did you not think that some of these too had been my doing? All the petty fragments of compressed sand and gravel, the broken bricks of once bright but burning wonder, the yearning of souls dead to the world and seeking the undead in another world, they are already there, like this one now is to be. Raven was astonished at Kanakalik's perspicacity and foresight. All he could do was utter out a croaky oath of gratitude. But there was one thing that Kanakalik could not have known. You can turn a person into stone, but not an idea. No number of forgotten monuments could bury the fires of vengeance and spite. They smolder still, old one, and they even burn as well in us. Thank you again.